Oh my god, what's that smell? First they ask you guys to bring your own food, and someone had to bring rotten eggs, huh? God, that's terrible. Okay, whoever brought the rotten skunk carcass, please throw it away from any living thing as soon as possible. Oh, sheesh. I think that, yeah, that I had stomach problems. Okay. Alright, I think the smell has died down just in time too. I think some of my brain cells were starting to die. Okay, whatever that was has effectively made me completely lose my appetite. Oh god, I still think I taste it in the back of my mouth. Give me a minute. Okay, that's better. What? Oh, this? Ah, this is just a little something I made in case something like this would ever happen again. Trust me, when you smell the stench of a rotten skunk carcass baking in the heat of a Floridian summer, you try your best to come up with any sort of home remedies. Believe it or not, that wasn't the worst odor I've smelled. That's only really because I was too close to the body when I found it, thank God. Lord only knows how sick I would have been had I been an inch closer. Let me explain. When I was about 10 or 11, one of my parents' church friends gifted my mom some mangoes. You see, my mom loves mangoes so much, I would say kind of borders on obsession. I honestly have no doubt that there is no way that one mango tree could possibly satisfy her craving. I remember that there have been days where we obtained more than 30 mangoes and there wasn't a single one after a week. Now, this wasn't just my mom that ate them. My brother-in-law loves mangoes as well, but I can guarantee that the bulk was eaten by my mom. Anyways, the issue was that this was a Sunday and my family and I were going to church. And since their friends gave my mother the mangoes at the beginning of the day and she decided to leave it in the car, the mangoes began to smell. Keep in mind, this was a Floridian summer on a Sunday where temperatures commonly reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the service lasted around 2 hours. When we returned to the car, what I can only describe as the most overwhelming stench of decay that even a dead animal carcass could hope to rival filled my nostrils. I remember recently smelling decaying mango skin, and the smell is so putrid that you instantly recoil. And on top of that, it stays with you. It lingers in the back of your throat. So imagine that times 20, all encased within a car, and having to be inside of that car for 20 minutes. The odor was so bad, I had to stick my head outside of the car multiple times to feel some relief after taking even the slightest waft of that foul air. Well, all this talk about sour air actually perfectly fits the story I had prepared for tonight. You see, the mystery creature we're covering tonight is one that is notorious for the horrid smell that it emits, one that perhaps isn't just deadly for the nose, but perhaps deadly overall. Tell me, how many of you believe in aliens? Well, whatever you believe might dictate your belief in the story I'm about to tell you, and perhaps maybe some of you will become believers? Well, whatever you believe, I think you'll find this story quite interesting. And so, as always, huddle up by the fire, and let me tell you the story of Noxious Fumes in Flatwoods. West Virginia is a state in the eastern part of the United States, and within it resides a town named Flatwoods in Braxton County. Despite what the name may suggest, or at the very least what I had originally thought, Flatwoods is actually the name of the town, not the name of a forest. The town was founded by a pastor by the name of John Clark, who started a church in the land in 1930. The city didn't receive municipality until 7 years later in 1901. The town was named Flatwoods after the flat land on and near many rivers and creeks that the town was founded upon. As I mentioned before, the town is small. having a population of only 265 and doesn't really grow much past that. In 2010, the town had a reported population of 277, with the largest population the town has ever had being as little as 405. The town is close to Sutton, a city who has been rather known lately for recently opening one of the only two Bigfoot museums east of the Mississippi. Flatwoods' close proximity to Sutton and Burnsville Lake has also made it a popular destination for fishing and hunting. The Salt Lake Camping Grounds also offers a camping experience near the lakes. Regarding the wildlife, it has all the animals you could possibly think of when you think of a typical American ecosystem. Black bears, deers, cougars, and bobcats all tend to be the larger game to be found there. And as for the smaller game, there's skunks, chipmunks, groundhogs, flying squirrels, raccoons, opossums, and hares. Other animals include beavers, bats, otters, several species of owls, and an animal named an eastern hellbender, essentially a giant salamander. Some are so big that they can grow up to 2 feet. As for some of the most dangerous animals, save the obvious like bears and cougars, beware of the timber rattlesnake, as there are some of the most dangerous snakes in America. They'll give you a good warning if you get too close, and they don't tend to be aggressive at all. If you don't hear their warnings, well, they'll make sure you're sorry. They have large fangs that inject a powerful venom strong enough to kill you anywhere within 6 to 48 hours. Luckily, there is an antivenom that results in a 99% recovery rate if administered within 2 hours. But if you're traversing the woods alone, then things aren't looking too good for you. But overall, this is even if you're traversing the woods to begin with, as there is another creature that is infamous for its lethal nature that can crawl into your home, onto your seats, or maybe any bags or purses that you may have with you. I'm of course talking about the Black Widow. Well, in actuality, the bite is rarely fatal, and just like the timber rattlesnake, they'll only bite when truly disturbed. But still, getting a bite from this infamous spider is sure to lead you to the hospital. Despite how good of a hunting ground West Virginia is, and by proxy Flatwoods due to its close proximity to the lakes, Flatwoods is known across the United States for one particular incident. One that has occurred a few decades ago. One that made Flatwoods gain such an infamy among all residents in the US, and one that Flatwoods has taken advantage of to a great extent. If you ever go to the town, you'll see the image of a strange thing plastered all across the town, immortalizing and capitalizing the popularity and intriguing nature of the occurrence. The capitalization of the incident reaches as far as Sutton, as even they have a museum dedicated to it. I am, of course, talking about the terror that came from the stars and has seeded its undying, horrific nature into the minds of all who witnessed it or have ever heard of the monstrosity. The Flatwoods Monster. The Flatwoods Monster, also known as the Green Monster, the Braxton County Monster, or Braxy, is described as a monstrous metallic humanoid of a terrifying nature, believed to be extraterrestrial in origin. It towers over all men, being at least twice as tall as the average man. It possesses a metallic body, typically being described as some robotic suit of rather odd design. The entity possesses an orangish red, featureless mask. That is, featureless with the exception of its haunting glowing eyes that shine beams of light that will sear itself into your brain until the end of days. The eyes have been said to glow an ominous shade of greenish orange to a threateningly terrifying shade of vibrant red. From there, its mask is further overshadowed by an odd metallic hood that looms over the top of the head, described as a similar shape to an ace of spades. The chest is similar to a smooth chest plate, and from the waist down it possesses something similar to a metallic skirt. It's a green or black and colorless cylindrical corrugated mechanical limb that is believed to allow the entity to levitate off the ground. It is believed that this section is also responsible for producing a gas that dissolves into a thick mist whose odor has been described as similar to sulfur burnt metal. Those who have inhaled the mist have felt stinging in their noses and burning in their eyes. Typically, those who have been in the presence of the gas have suffered ill side effects including nausea, headaches, damage to the lungs, difficulty breathing, vomiting, and as reported by some, even lung cancer. It also possesses small, clawed arms, and although the size of this feature is far from intimidating, given the overshadowing size of the hood and the rest of the suit, the proportions of these limbs compared to the head seem to be normal enough to add a threatening edge. Even if for whatever reason the presence of such a monster doesn't already strike fear into your heart, you're sure to feel far from safe. Those who have encountered it have reported it possesses an aggressive nature. Those who do not flee from its presence will be sprayed by a substance similar to crude oil, and from there it rushes you, claws extended and filling the air with a soul-shaking scream. There have been only one to have witnessed the monster without its suit, at least without the top portion. It was only believed that these monsters were the same due to the presence of the same smell and the levitation device from the waist down. Once it has removed its mask and hood, and its armor has been shed, it possesses a body similar to a man, but completely covered in dead green scales, with an elongated head, dead, soulless, wide eyes, and a naturally long mouth, and no hair, nose, or ears. Its arms are long and thin, disproportionately longer than that in comparison to a human. Its fingers are also disproportionately longer, and it's believed to possess 2 fingers, although it is likely that it also possesses a thumb that's just not as predominant in size or position as the other 2. It is clear that if this monster exists, it is not from our world, or any world that we know of. It was a mildly cold September dusk. It was Friday, September 12th, 1952. A group of boys had finished school a few hours ago and decided to play some tackle football. After all, there were no teachers or supervisors of any kind to dissuade them from the such. The group consisted of Freddie May, Ronnie Shaver, Tom Heyer, all age 10, and Neil Nunley, age 14. As they were throwing the ball around and bringing each other to the ground, forcing each other to eat dirt and grass with their tackles, a sudden boom broke through the silence of the night. In the air, we could see a glowing and flaming object, leaving streaks of fire in its wake as it tore through the skies. Was it a crashing airplane, or maybe a meteor? Or maybe... You see, the boys were fans of aliens, and they knew better than most that aliens would come in a spacecraft, and all the spacecrafts they had seen grew similar to the flaming object in the sky. They stared at it, one picking up the ball while his eyes were fixated on the omen from the stars. They watched it with the purpose of knowing the craft's intentions, and they saw it land just over the horizon, just on top of the hill next to the Bailey Fisher farm, and they saw how it descended vertically. They decided to take it upon themselves to investigate. After all, maybe it was an airplane and someone might have needed help. The bright lights emitting from the hill served as a beacon to mark the location of what could have very well been the harbinger of the fate of the world. Freddie followed the railroad tracks near the school to get to his grandparents' house. See, Kathleen May, his mother, had taken Freddie and his brother Eddie to visit his grandparents, and he also knew that his cousin, Eugene Lemon, would be there. Eugene Lemon, even though he was only 17 at the time, was already part of the National Guard, so if there was any threat on top of that ill-fated hill, at the very least there would be someone of significant protective status there with them. Onwards along the railroad tracks they walked, contemplating every probability. Deep inside them, they could feel an instinctive fear, of what was to come, but they decided to ignore such an emotion. While any of the contemplated possibilities would have likely been terrifying, it was clear to them that they wished to know what had occurred over their own safety. They eventually made it to the Lemon House, and Freddy explained to his mother what they had witnessed. They told them how they saw a flaming object falling from the sky, glowing hauntingly vivid hues of burning reds and yellows, and how it made a nesting site of the hill next to the Fisher farm. Kathleen, not easily convinced, pressed them for questions concerning the falling object, and upon hearing everyone's account in detail and finding neither ill intention nor discrepancy on the boys' accounts, she became convinced of the truth behind their sighting. Her belief was solidified when she walked outside of the house to gaze at the hill herself and witnessed the beacon bursting from the hilltop. For whatever reason, instead of being disturbed, she was invigorated to explore the object from the stars. She wasn't convinced of the idea that the object was extraterrestrial in origin, or at least in the traditional sense, but she was still convinced that it was likely a meteor that had landed on top of the hill. Eugene gathered a flashlight and his faithful dog, Ricky, and from there the party of 7 made their ill-fated march towards that dreadful hill. A quarter of a mile they treaded on with the single thought of discovery and even potential fame, but of course this was just a secondary thought. As they pushed onwards, the pulsating light shined ever brighter, and with it, their anxiety. The lights pulsated in such a vibrant rhythm that soon they felt as if their very heartbeats synced with the throbbing of the lights. Their fate was on that hill, and only God could stop them from discovering what was resting at its peak. Soon, the idea that perhaps the orange glow came from a plane and perhaps it had been a crashed airplane entered their minds. The thought that perhaps someone was injured pushed them further, and it almost felt as if some invisible force was propelling them onwards. Not even the fence that surrounded the hill could stand in the way, and soon the lights were more luminous than the sun. Suddenly, the light had moved. No longer was the light the beacon on top of the hill, but instead, it descended, as if to greet those adventurous and trepidatious 7. Their dog sensed something that warranted a need within him to sense out some danger that lay before him. And so he ran ahead, barking frantically, attempting to scare off any would-be aggressors. But for however noble the dog was, it soon returned with its tail caught between its legs, and a shiver of traumatic memories overtook the poor dog. Despite this, they pressed on. They weren't sure if it was the cold of the coming fall, if it was the anxiety-induced adrenaline that made them shiver like a wet dog. But whatever the source, they did not take heed. Onwards they marched, and as they did, they noticed how the branches of the dead trees around them jutted out of the dark, as if the moments in which they were not being observed were moments in which the trunks and the twigs would move to snatch whoever got too close. The night looked darker than usual, as if the skies blackened for this very moment. Even the moon itself attempted to resist the darkness, but even it was just a waning crescent among a sky full of dark stars. The silence was deafening. The snap of the dried branches and dead leaves was the only thing that filled their ears. Not a single cricket or bird was comfortable enough to make even the slightest peep. It wasn't long before the source of the light made itself apparent, and a sort of glowing, semi-spherical craft a few 50 feet in front of them, glowing in such a manner that no sane machine or modern man could have ever conceived, never mind brought to life. It was around 5 feet in height and just about a few feet larger than half a bus. The glowing presented itself like a bonfire, burning bright, almost burning their eyes by the sheer intensity. A sound similar to some sort of hissing or sizzling was emitting from the object, followed by some sort of squealing or loud thumping.
Although they weren't entirely sure that it was from the object itself, it felt as if the sound surrounded them, all-encompassing and getting louder. Of a sudden, a deep mist enclosed on them, and the stench of what seemed like 100 rotten eggs, and the worst fumes from an oil factory similar to burnt metal blitzed their nostrils. The smell was so grotesque that they could feel a burning sensation seated deep within their eyes and lungs, almost as if the fire of the ship was burning within them. And then, from the mist, they saw something. A profound sense of dread took over Kathleen, and she now knew that this was no meteorite, it was no crashed airplane. It was something otherworldly, ungodly, and perhaps downright diabolical. And a deep-seated urge to flee as quick as possible washed over her, and yet she was paralyzed, unable to move, as if something had anchored her feet in place. What had destined them to arrive on that cursed hill presented itself to them in such a way that it would activate the most profound dread within them. Not much could be seen through the mist, and so Eugene directed his flashlight to the haunter in the dark. He expected an owl, or perhaps maybe something else perched on the tree beside it. Instead, the beam of light revealed the presence of a horror unlike any seen on Earth. A mask of crimson red, moving 10 to 12 feet off of the ground, lit up with eyes that reflected the flashlight's beam with the shade of green prevailed by orange. However, to some, they saw an evil spark of red behind the light. An ebony spade-like hood loomed over the mask like something a cult leader would wear, and its body was protected by darkened metal. It wore what seemed like a breastplate, and under that is what looked like a skirt made of corrugated metal sheets. The monster that had presented itself to the group sent a shudder of such profound and primal fear that it forced Eugene on his side, and with it, the flashlight. And now, with only the light of that damned craft, the creature lit up internally and began to move towards them. Whatever it was not walking. No. Instead, it was hovering towards them. And as it did so, the source of the fog became apparent as the aperture that made up the thing's skirt emitted thick clouds of fog from it, intensifying the horrendous odor. It rose from the ground and followed an arc, landing in front of them. Eugene flashed and kicked to get back up on the ground, but the adrenaline within him made it almost impossible to get any sense of motor control or grip. All he could do was feel a hapless sense of primordial fear as the thing grew closer every cursed moment. Time seemed to slow for the group, each one of them backing away slowly, but seemingly unable to run, hypnotized by the uniqueness and unearthliness of what presented themselves to them. It was only when the thing began to eject a thick oily fluid at them that their hypnotized state broke and the urge to run began to take hold. As they began to turn tail and flee, the monster outstretched a pair of horrid claws towards them as if to grasp one of them before they fled and let out a deafening cry that would make a banshee cower. Just as though they could stop them from reaching the source of light on top of that blighted hill, there was no force on earth that could stop them from fleeing whatever monstrosity they had just encountered. The dog practically led the other six, and Eugene led them afterwards. Onwards they ran as far as they could back to their house. The burning in their lungs from the gas was so great in the heat within them now that even the greatest effort to bottom the exhaustion could not deter them from getting to safety. Down the hill, through the fence, across the grass, they dashed like madmen. So great was their urgency that Kathleen even jumped over the fence. And finally, when the sight of that horrendous hill was gone, they were able to return back to their house and finally get some rest. Kathleen immediately called the police, attempting to treat the now passed out Eugene. Leotha, Kathleen's mother, attempted her best but could not find a way to remove the oily substance covering the clothes of the traumatized group. For the group, however, clean clothes was the last thing they were concerned about. Each one of them experienced some sort of illness, and the biting in their lungs from the gas was of no aid.
Some vomited, experienced migraines, had accelerated heartbeats, felt feverish, and Jean altogether collapsed. Plenty of them felt sick for several days, and Jean was feeling symptoms for weeks. Unfortunately, Jean's beloved dog did not survive the incident and passed away just a few days after that god-forsaken night. The doctor who checked on them stated something that would shock most and would clearly traumatize the group further than it already did. The doctor reported that all of them showed similar symptoms to being exposed to concentrated mustard gas. Sheriff Robert Carr and Deputy Bonnell arrived at the Lemon House, where the supposed witnesses currently resided after their alleged encounter. They had had a long night investigating wild claims of glowing spacecrafts that landed in remote areas, and they were quite exhausted of the fantastical tales of little men from outer space being spun on as some sort of genuine threat that actually needs to be dealt with. They weren't concerned, nor really interested, but the existence of some sort of malady brought on by the supposed encounter the boys had with the creature warranted them to go ahead and take a look at the scene. Upon their arrival to the house, they noticed a journalist by the name of Mr. A. Lee Stewart of the Braxton Democrat. They quickly became agitated further at the prospect of this anecdote of a misidentified owl or something more terrestrial or aerial than extraterrestrial in nature was going to gain some sort of attention beyond a dinner party and close friends, which would likely lead to further calls from half-minded individuals who claim to have witnessed a genuine descent of aliens through bloodshot drunken eyes by a tenfold. They became further motivated to deal with this encounter as quickly and effectively as possible, lest the parasite of a journalist begins to rip apart their reputations off of baseless claims of a government conspiracy or cover-up that those sharks love to report on so much. Acknowledging the presence of the writer, they began to interview the witnesses and listened with a great degree of skepticism of their fantastical tales of a mechanical, hooded alien that descended in a glowing spacecraft that illuminated the woods to such a degree that it would put the sun to shame, produced a sickening mist from some sort of levitation system with bright, dreadful red eyes offset by a blood-red mask, and that it let out a deafening screech upon the acknowledgement that it would strike down the organisms that lay before it without the need to ponder the possibility of a threat. While truly the more bizarre and horror-inducing stories that they had heard while dealing with supposed extraterrestrials, they were still more skeptical of the nature of such a creature and decided to investigate the scene for a likely culprit. They had determined that they were likely not lying, anyways their terror seemed genuine enough, but they had no intentions of humoring such a tale with any sort of dignity beyond a rational explanation. Considering most of the boys were far too young, they had requested that Eugene led them out to the site where the monster touched the ground. He outright refused. He could barely make a coherent sentence just a few minutes ago just due to the sheer fright. How could he even return? He wasn't even sure if the thing was still there or not. What if it was waiting for him? What if it prepared some sort of weapon capable of disintegrating him or freezing him or anything else whose purpose was far removed from any innocuous nature? Absolutely not. He had seen far too many movies in which aliens interacted with humans, and it always resulted in the extermination of all signs of life within the poor souls who deemed the extraterrestrials remotely approachable. He had just escaped death once. He wasn't just going to risk his life once more so that some skeptical, pretentious policeman could judge and tell him what he had witnessed. His adamance was great, but eventually, after long conversation and introduction of a shotgun within his palms and within the hands of all that would accompany him, he was more willing, although wholeheartedly against the thought of venturing back to that forbidden hill. However, he knew it was his responsibility, and found it within himself to at least repress the urge to keep still and away from the hill for the rest of his day. So, they and a few other men ventured forth. The skies were still as dark as they had been, the trees just as dead, and as aggressive in their need to prevent further movement with their broken limbs as before. Neither the birds nor the bugs saw it fit to return, and so their ensemble had not resumed even in the later part of the evening. Every step they took disrupted the ever-present silence, with the crack of snapping of twigs and dead leaves. The forest had not let up its warning from before, but yet, once more, the group persisted and marched to the site where the cursed encounter took place. Eugene's nerves were wrecked entirely. The booming throbbing of his heart was only surpassed by the nausea and trembling with every fiber of his muscles. The shotgun in his hands were held with such a grip that even if his arms were to be severed, they would surely be bound with the shotgun just as firmly as before. The cops held theirs mildly, simply gazing through the landscape for an indication of anything that could have occurred, more concerned with the luminosity of the flashlight than the assurance of their weapons. The reporter was close by and hadn't exactly been as firm with his grip, but held it more closely than the officers. A dripping became apparent, and while at first ran across the minds of the others of the group, it was soon made evident that the source of the sound came from Eugene himself. Beads of sweat were trickling down his face at any given moment. With a trembling voice, he indicated that they were at their destination. The cops scoured, but all that was revealed by the dimming flashlight was nothing of an unusual nature. All the mundanity of a darkened forest and the pale moon. The officers hadn't really expected anything to the contrary of what they witnessed, but were still agitated nonetheless, as if they weren't really expecting more yet somehow received less. In a rather belittling tone, they dismissed themselves, explaining that they would return in the morning to examine the scene for any evidence of this supposed close encounter. The other men had decided to stay and look around for anything of any significance, and while at first their investigation was rather fruitless, finding nothing but a few snapped twigs and minor claw marks on the bark of a nearby dead tree, one man hollered to the others, directing their gazes at a rather peculiar circular indentation in the grass. Not a single blade was spinned, and each one was crushed in dirt. Another had discovered two precise indentations, 6 to 7 feet off the ground, like scrapes that led down the hill towards the landing site. In addition, no foxfires were present, and so the luminescence of that pavement line had no explanation of biology. The dawn brought the release from the trauma of the darkness, and the officers drove out to investigate whatever the scene had like to offer, assuming the wildlife had already altered the evidence beyond recognition as anything relevant. With their morning coffee in hand and only half a night's of rest, they approached the site that faint-hearted youth had led them to not but a few hours ago. Carr had been discussing with Bernal theories as to what they had likely seen, and both of them had seemed to agree that more than likely they saw a bear or an owl that they couldn't see fully in the darkness, that their imaginative mind ended up filling the gaps with extraterrestrial ideas. However, once they stepped onto that cursed place, they noted all of the things which the group had seen the night before. The grass had been smashed in a similar manner, each blade pressed against the dirt and none spared. Scrape marks lining each dead tree sloped down towards the hill where the encounter had taken place, and not a single growth of foxfires of any kind on any of the decaying bark had been seen. Other features had been discovered as well. A dark, oily substance covered many of the blades of grass, and tire tracks were found near the site through the forest. A metallic and plastic-like substance covered in the same fluid had been found at the scene, and the presence of that foul odor had made itself known. The cops suffered the stench of that godforsaken night, and it was only thanks to him that monster had decided that to stay on that ill-fated hill was not of its best interest. Soon, to the bewilderment of the town, the military had arrived, sending them to a state of panic, not out of fear of the military themselves, but of the implications that the presence of the military had. The military were well aware of the incident and had arrived because of such reports. The police had led them to the site of the supposed encounter, and they closed it off from the public. And during this time, they took environmental samples, primarily soil samples. For what purpose and what had become of these tests are unknown to this very day. The night haunted the group for weeks. It had been as long before any of them decided to feel the glow of the moonlight until about long.
The day was September 13th, 1952. Just one day after the Flatwoods monster had made its horrendous presence known. At around 8 p.m., George and Edith Statowski were on their way back home to Babylon, New York, down a road in Frametown. Their 18-month-old son was accompanying them in their travel from state to state, and he was fast asleep in the car. In their vacation, they looked through what each state had to offer, and now, after a long and rather exhausting trip, they were ready to return back to the streets of Babylon. All seemed well enough, and they had already planned on staying at an inn for the night when the first decent moon made itself apparent. The radio was filling the car with the melodic and quite extraordinary talents of Frank Sinatra, Bill Crosby, and Artie Shaw. And as their minds were in a gleeful state of blissful ignorance, a violent halt to the car's tires and the thumping of internal car parts aroused the couple from their phased state and jolted them into a state of bewilderment and panic. George exited the vehicle with a keen eye for any possible culprits responsible for the car's sudden reluctance to move forward. And soon he spotted that, for whatever reason, the engine had given out. His curiosity intensified with his growing annoyance. He had just renovated the engine. How is it possible that he's experiencing such an issue? Try as he might, the engine would not obey his attempts of revving it back up. In the middle of both the night and the road, it would appear that they would be fixed until either the engine gave up its tantrum or until someone could come along to inspect the malfunctioning engine. Even the radio had given up the melodic voices of Sinatra, Crosby, and Shaw with monotonous static in its place. Their annoyance grew ever more so, and George, not satisfied with the idea that the culprit was the exclusive source of their sudden halt, he circled the car in search for any accomplices. Soon, off in the distance, through the shadowed branches and hollowed bark of the forest, grew a faint, soft, and noticeable, ever-present violet red. Edith, entranced by such a light, rolled the windows down to ensure the sight wasn't just some trick of the refractory nature of the windows. Instantly, both of them were hit by a grotesque and putrid odor, equivalent to that of 1,000 eggs left in the sun to rot with some sort of faint trace of burnt metal. The object that was emitting the violet light started to intensify, and by the shifting of the shadows on the bark, it was clear to both of them that whatever it was that lay in front of them, it was moving towards them. Either from a state of madness or some vague ignorance of the primal need of preservation, George began to make his pace towards the object himself. Edith, either caught up by the same trance or taken over by curiosity, did not dissuade George from his march towards the iridescent object that was approaching him. As he pressed on, his ignorance soon faded, and the urge for preservation had begun to seed within him, reminding him of the potential threat of this unknown thing. Yet, once more, he ignored such a thought. Just as soon, he felt as if the static of the radio had materialized itself, and he felt the sensation of 1,000 needle-like vibrations shaking his nerves. The trees, they seemed more dead than before. The mist, it was thicker than when he had first glanced at it. Oh, that blinding light, that God-forsaken luminescence, it was clear that whatever it may be, the last thing that should cross any sane person's mind is that it is something remotely approachable if one is intent on remaining unharmed. By the grace of God, Edith had not been cut up in an entrance so intense as George's, and so her position allowed her to warn him of a looming figure that had been lurking from the shadows, observing him from behind. The sensation of both dread and the vibrations that had persisted soon awakened his primal instincts. And when he turned around, he witnessed before him a figure of grey stature unlike anything seen in heaven, hell, or earth. All he needed to know was the size of the monster that instantly sent him flying for his car. feet after feet, it felt as if the thing, whatever it was, would be able to enact its will onto him at whatever moment. He felt as if the mists would soon incapacitate him through suffocation, or the overwhelming stench would soon bring him to the ground by some sort of nausea-induced state, or that the trees would soon trap him as they felt to draw closer and closer to the car, as if they were intent on trapping him in order to please the hellish entity behind him. Despite all that was against him, he was able to make it to the car, and he rushed in and slamming the door with such a ferocity that it threatened to turn her over entirely. Their son was seemingly unfazed by the whole event, and was perceivably quiet. His silence was now recognized, however, as the static grew louder, as if intent on calling out to the source of that cursed light. The fight soon evolved into pure dread, as they realized the car had still not given up its ill-timed refusal to work. The blood in their faces drained as they saw the little figure move out of the woods and towards their car. Tears flooded Edith's face, and hysteria almost took hold over her, and her instinct to remain quiet had not been sufficiently strong enough. While George kept as still as one was humanly capable, the thinking was almost impossible to avoid as the adrenaline coursing through his veins mixed with the urgent necessity to cover his nostrils from the intensified stench. The thing circled their car, almost as if it was observing the rudimentary mechanism the organisms inside used to travel what they would consider great distances. The glare of those glassy, soulless, almost fake-looking eyes burned themselves into their nightmares, and the stares of the body reflected the luminescence emitted by the light in the woods, but not as much as the presumed mechanism underneath its waist. There was a corrugated, metallic-looking stump, and from it emitting those terrible, horrible, odorous mist. Despite all of the Earth's efforts, the device would not fall to the ground, as if mocking the very planet it now resided in. It then presented itself before them in all of its horror. Its head was elongated, its eyes sunken, its body was bloated, and the arms that protruded from its shoulders were long and spindly. Every part was covered in what appeared to be green scale-like structures. However, the pale moonlight was merciful, as it left the majority of the cursed figure in shadows, but the evil of the violet light still illuminated some of the demonic figure before them. Whatever it was, it lay what they perceived to be its hand on the hood of the car. For what hidden, likely malicious purpose, they never knew. Suddenly a burst of light illuminated the entity before them in such a manner that it was just as indistinguishable in the pallid moonlight, and illuminated in such a way that it was almost blinding. In the light, they could see what they witnessed was the entity that mocked the planet further by rising into the skies and disappearing forevermore from their presence. George and Edith sat there, George with more of a presence of profound dread, and Edith with one of hysteria and relief now that the necessity to keep her voice ever so quiet when the presence of such a thing was now no longer needed. What in God's creation was that thing? Well, they would never know. But it was gone now. But then began some realization that they were unaware of the thing's intentions and therefore did not know if it had intent to return, jolted them to look for a method to flee as quickly as possible. They tried the car again, and finally the engine was satisfied with its state of dormancy and started once more. The radio once more began to play the melodic voices of Sinatra, Crosby, and Shaw, and drove out to Sutton. Upon arriving, they stayed at a motel for the night, and they conversed with themselves on what had occurred. Nothing sane, rational, or even commonly supernatural could come to their mind as a possible explanation as to what they had just seen, to any sort of satisfactory degree. In the morning, they made sure to fill up their gas tanks before they continued their route back to their home. And as they were filling the car, one of the attendants gave a curious glance at the hood of their car. They looked at George and inquired about the odd V-shaped burn left on the hood. The most predominant and honestly most realistic explanation as to what the original group had witnessed that one fateful night is a barn owl. Now, of course, owls don't emit gaseous fumes or create fire streaks, but those come with alternate explanations. The barn owl primarily explains the monster itself. First, consider the fact that the group was in the woods near the Bailey Fisher farm, so the presence of a barn owl within the area would not only make complete sense, they would be very common in the area. From there, the height of the creature could just be primarily attributed to the fact that the owl would have been perched on top of a tree. After that, also take into consideration that the eyes only lit up after a flashlight was shined on the face of the creature, like an eye shine effect that is definitely present in owls. The floating could easily just be flying. Even the small claws could also easily be described as extended owl talons. Owls also tend to produce hissing sounds when they're taking an aggressive stance, which an owl may take if it's, protecting its young. September does fall within the season in which barn owls have babies, so it isn't unlikely at all that maybe this was a female barn owl that was just protecting its babies. Now, to add to that, the face of the monster was described as red, and while yes, most barn owls have a white face, there are female barn owls that have a dull orangish face, which could have perhaps been seen as a more vibrant red because of the red coloration that some of the witnesses reported in the eyes. Well, what about the floating device? Well, it was described as cylindrical, but in the dark, it's highly unlikely that it could have been accurately described as a perfect cylinder. And it was described as corrugated, but once again, it's unlikely that the description is 100% accurate. The main information that we can take with any sort of believability is the fact that the object was long, it was round, had some pattern, and had a greenish hue, at least according to Kathleen May. Given that information, it is likely that this levitation device, so to speak, is likely just a bush that was behind the owl as it was perched on top of the tree branch. Well, what about the hood? Well, it is obvious that a barn owl doesn't have an ace of spade design looming over its head. Perhaps there's an alternate explanation. Well, we'll cover that part next, but for the most part, the owl theory does explain a lot of things seen by the group. And what about the smell? Well, there could be many sources to that smell. One likely candidate is methane gas that is typically produced by rotten carcasses. Methane gas produced from such a source has been described as similar to rotting eggs, which also consists of a similar smell to what was described by those who smelled the gas. However, the most predominant theory is that the odor was actually produced by a specific type of grass whose smell is described exactly like what the witnesses smelled: sulfur and burnt metal. Now, of course, the smell isn't overwhelming, but perhaps there was a significantly higher density of that grass in that area that could have just produced a more concentrated smell. In addition, fear tends to heighten one's sense of smell, and perhaps this also contributing to the overwhelming stench. As for the mist, it could have simply been fog. While fog does form most often in the autumn, perhaps it would have been possible that that night was cold enough to produce some sort of fog, or perhaps it was just simply something they imagined during their panic in order to produce a more ominous memory. Now, of course, a barn owl can't produce any sort of flaming streaks across the sky, but a meteor definitely can. Of course, you would need a meteor in order for this to be a plausible explanation. Well, considering that Maryland Academy had reported a meteor had passed over Baltimore at 7 p.m. on September 12th, 1952, It's pretty difficult to deny the idea that this was a meteor, just by that fact alone. But of course, also take into consideration that it was reported to be a flaming object and it glowed a red and orange color, like something on fire. The supposed spacecraft had been reported across multiple cities, not just in Flatwoods, and even across multiple states. Well, where's the impact? The boys said the object had landed on top of the hill near the Bailey Fisher farm. But did it really? Well, probably not. They said that the object descended on top of the hill, but more than likely they just saw the meteor moving past the visible horizon. Even assuming it did land on the hill, it could have simply burned up before it landed. Now, I'm no expert on this, so perhaps the meteorite couldn't have been large enough for it to be both visible and small enough to burn up completely before it was going to hit the top of the hill. But, assuming it was, perhaps this could have also been the source of the terrible smell. After all, meteors tend to contain many sulfur-containing compounds and are predominantly made of metal. Therefore, the smell would make sense if it burned up so close to the site of the supposed impact. Overall, the latter part of the theory is more focused on the assumption that the meteorite had even been approaching the hill and wasn't just flying overhead, which is pretty unlikely. More than likely, this is just a massive case of hysteria that caused the Flatwoods monster to be perceived the way that it was, given that it was indeed just a barn owl. Normally, people don't confuse barn owls for aliens though, even in the dead of night. So why exactly did a group of 7 individual people all confuse the same barn owl as a supposed alien with the exact same description? Simple. Fear. You see, they didn't exactly see the thing for long, and whatever they perceived in the dark moonlight was likely filled in by their imaginations, and from there whatever seemed plausibly perceived by one could have been thought to have been perceived by the rest when discussing the incident after their escape from the supposed monster. In layman's terms, they thought they saw an alien, and whatever one person saw that the others also thought they could have seen is what they thought they saw. But why an alien? Why not any other type of monster? Well, let me tell you a bit about alien culture. You see, aliens in the 1950s are like what zombies are to us in the 2000s and 2010s. Literally everywhere. Many iconic alien movies came out in the 1950s, such as the original The Thing, The Blob, The Day the Earth Stood Still, The War of the Worlds, Robot Monster, Day the World Ended, and even Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Typically, the main thing they had in common were aggressive and malicious extraterrestrials primarily focused on wiping out humanity. They were comic books, TV shows, even alien cults such as the Seekers, Unarius, the Hysteria Society, and the Cosmic Circle of Fellowship. While most of these were founded after this incident took place, it just goes to show you the influence that alien culture had in 1950s America. The cause? Well, there's 2 that I can highlight. One is the Battle of Los Angeles. For those unfamiliar with the event, in 1952 in Los Angeles, California, an alarm was raised at 7:18 p.m. Afterwards, several anti-aerial shots were fired into the sky towards an unknown assailant. America had just entered World War II after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, which happened only 3 months before the Battle of Los Angeles. Considering the bombardment of Santa Barbara and Elwood occurred only the day before, it's no wonder that it was suspected that it was the Japanese army that had attacked the city for some while. Well, that is, until the Japanese government confirmed that no airplanes flew over Los Angeles at the time. Considering that Japan was the only military at the time that was actually attacking the United States, who or what was this aerial assailant? Well, the government has stated that it was a weather balloon that was mistaken for some sort of aggressive airplane, which prompted the first shell to be fired. Subsequent shots were fired likely due to warners. I mean, the constant threat of an aerial bombing occurring at any given point in time is, well, pretty nerve-wracking, and so it's pretty easy to imagine the reason why the soldiers started firing after the first shot was fired. But to some, they didn't really take this explanation as reasonable, and they perpetuated the idea that the aerial assailant was extraterrestrial in origin. Whether or not this was based on any sort of facts other than the supposed attacker was unseen and therefore anything that could sustain itself in the air and still be seen from a rather significant distance could be a plausible candidate is unknown to me. To some ufologists, the only real center of debate is whether the purpose of their presence within the Los Angeles skies was malicious in nature. Whether or not this was an alien invasion, it's highly likely the event influenced alien culture in the 50s. More than likely, however, the prime suspect behind the prominence of extraterrestrial belief and the usage in media was Roswell. More than likely, the majority of you have heard of the Roswell incident. For those unfamiliar with the event, let me keep it short. Essentially, an aerial object had crash-landed near a ranch in July of 1947 in Roswell, New Mexico. What had crash-landed has been up for debate for many different conspiracy theories, since the United States military arrived at the scene pretty quickly and secured the object. Initially, they released a statement stating that the object was a flying disc, but then quickly retracted the statement saying that it was actually a crashed weather balloon. According to many ufologists, however, it is likely that the Roswell incident was actually a crashed alien spacecraft with aliens within, and that the military and government are covering it all up. To be honest, if it was an alien spacecraft, I don't really see the military or government freely admitting that it would be, and I completely see them covering everything up. But considering there's no real evidence to support the theory that the crashed object was extraterrestrial in origin, I think I'll just stick with the military's report. They did further revise their report in 1997, stating that it actually was a nuclear testing monitor balloon, and that whatever aliens within the craft that were reported were just test dummies. This would explain why the military was so quick to recover the craft, but why change the report? Well, the US had just begun the Cold War, so it's unlikely that they would want the Soviets to know that they had a method to detect their atomic bomb testing. On top of the fact that Project Mogul, the project under which the balloon was being developed, was considered top secret, and likely for this reason. Nothing changed the fact that this was likely one of the most well-known events linked with alien contact in American history, and all of it also occurred within the flying saucer craze of 1947, so it's not hard to imagine why this just fueled the fire for the next decade. It is likely that there are other factors such as advancing technologies and better understanding of astronomy, but it is clear that the alien culture of the 50s was prominent enough to likely influence and make fun of the boys who were witnesses that fateful night. Whether or not they had watched all that alien media I had mentioned earlier doesn't really matter. It was already known that these kids, at least kids at the time, were fans of aliens and the such. It's likely that when they saw the meteor, even though the possibility that it was a meteor did cross their minds, they more so believed it to be a spacecraft because they always believed that a spacecraft would look exactly like that falling meteor. And so they saw a spacecraft in place of a meteor, and therefore when they went to investigate what they perceived to be the landing site, they expected to see both a spaceship and an alien, and therefore saw one in place of anything else. You see, there's an interesting psychological phenomenon called the self-fulfilling prophecy, in which when someone believes something hard enough, it will come true. Now, of course, this is within reason. It's not like if someone wishes hard enough to become wealthy without any sort of actual effort, it will come true. Or that some sort of air quote quantum or mystical source of energy causes this to occur, but more so someone's perspective will change the way they perceive what happens. So, for example, if you believe yourself to be lacking any sort of happiness in your life, then you will perceive everything as depressing, finding ways to depress yourself and therefore fulfilling your beliefs, and therefore the so-called prophecy is fulfilled. So, how does this apply? Well, as I mentioned before, the witnesses were looking for aliens, and therefore, whatever phenomena that they deemed alien enough, they perceived as alien to them at the moment, and more so afterwards, with their brain adding extra details that perhaps weren't true in order to better conform to the idea that what they saw was an alien, such as perhaps the lights of the body lighting up in order to add an edge of advanced technology, or perhaps the body appearing shinier and therefore more metallic in nature in order to propose a more mechanical and robotic suit. The mixture of fear and hysteria definitely did not help keeping what they had witnessed true to reality. On top of that, the hysteria and fear very easily explains their symptoms. all the side effects that were felt by each of them directly parallels acute fear and elevated levels of adrenaline. After all, Eugene was reportedly the most terrified. I mean, he felt sick for weeks, and his fear of the dark and the night afterwards likely sustained whatever maladies he was feeling. It's also worth mentioning that all of their accounts had variations in them. I don't know how many of you remember Ivan T. Sanderson. I had mentioned him when I told you the story of Black Wings in Indonesia. Well, to remind you, he was the man responsible for preserving Dr. Ernst Bartels' account of the Ahul. He had actually conducted his own investigation of the Flatwoods monster soon after the encounter occurred and interviewed each of the witnesses. He found that many details varied, such as the size described anywhere from 7 to 10 to 12 to even 17 feet in height. The arms were a feature that only Kathleen saw, and the color of the so-called corrugated metallic skirt was only described as green by Kathleen herself. Everyone else had described it as colorless or black, and some didn't really even see it at all. You also had Neil, who reported seeing a flaming object in the background of the creature, while the other ones just saw the craft. The only real consistencies was that it was tall, it had a red face, and a metallic hood over its head. Speaking of that metallic hood, did you know that Galaxy Science Fiction magazine had published a magazine on August of 1952 that features aliens on the cover? And can you take a wild guess what shape their helmets were? It's likely that perhaps the kids had seen at least the cover of these magazines in passing at some point in time and therefore perceived something similar or perhaps a bit more exaggerated. And the moment that one of them brought it up, perhaps the others also thought they saw the feature as well. Now, in regards to the depression of the grass, there are natural phenomena that are capable of causing natural depressions, although none come to mind at the moment. There's also the possibility that perhaps something was placed there at some time before the event, or even something like a bear rolling around in the grass. Whatever caused it, there are alternate explanations for it apart from just extraterrestrial spacecrafts. What about the oil and rubbery or metallic thing found in the ground at the scene and the tire tracks? Well, something I had mentioned earlier is that the word of the encounter spread pretty quickly, and a few thrill seekers went to the area of the reported encounter. No one really found anything though. Well, one of these thrill seekers was Max Lockhart, who drove out to the location using his 1942 Chevrolet truck. Can you take a guess as to what the tire tracks were from? Also, take into consideration that this car was 10 years old at the time, so it makes sense that part of it was falling off or breaking down, accounting for the oily and rubbery or metallic thing found. The idea that perhaps the creature was just a hoax is actually a very likely theory. You see, Flatwoods was a completely unheard of and unknown town with little to no tourism, apart from just the occasional hunter. Perhaps the monster was made up in order to get more foot traffic. After all, the town went from unheard of to unknown across the entire United States after the supposed event occurred. And it's not exactly like the city is subtle about the fact that they were the place where the monster was seen. They capitalized on the event in full force. They literally renamed Flatwoods' motto to Home of the Green Monster and have a chair depicting the Flatwood monster near the town hall. Perhaps they took advantage of the meteor and someone made up the whole story, with Kathleen and the kids being promised fame or money in order to perpetuate the supposed encounter. Overall though, I don't exactly believe in this theory since I feel like someone would have said something by now, but either way, this is still completely plausible. I've been talking to you guys a lot about the main encounter, so let's go to the encounter about George and Edith Santowski. In regards to them, there is a lot to attempt to explain, and nothing is really that satisfying about the explanation. In regards to the engine, there could be any multitude of things that could have caused
an engine to break, even a new one. And perhaps there was some sort of other mechanism that they were unaware of that caused the car to break down. Now, in regards to what was originally seen, perhaps there was just a dead tree that looked especially haunting when George got close to it. That when Edith noticed it and in her scared state pointed it out, thinking it to be some sort of monster, George turned around and he also expected to see some sort of monster and saw the dead tree, and then his fear saw distinct features in the bark that made him perceive the tree as a monster. The weird sensation he was feeling that he described as 1,000 needles could have been attributed to fear and anxiety as he went to explore that violet light. The same fear could have contributed to the intensity of the smell, which as well could have come from the same grass, since it was clear that the smell intensified with his fear. Now, regarding the creature that was circling the car, my theory is that it could have been a combination of a helicopter using a spotlight and shadows. Well, that may seem a bit insane since people clearly know what a helicopter looks like. This wasn't entirely the case in the 1950s. You see, helicopters weren't widely used by the police, especially even the local police. It wasn't until 1956 when the first local police, specifically the New York Police Department, purchased their first helicopter. This was a full 4 years before that happened. Helicopters weren't even used in West Virginia by the police until 1972. Even though, yes, George and Edith were indeed from New York, considering that the first police-manned helicopters weren't even used until 4 years after the encounter, it's unlikely that they would have known what a helicopter looks like in the night sky. So, who was using the helicopter? Well, remember that the military was taking soil samples earlier that day, so I propose that this was a military helicopter that was flying overhead using a spotlight in search for something. The helicopter was flying towards them using a dim spotlight and shined that light towards them, causing their shadow to appear behind them, which, in their fear-induced state, they believed was the same monster from earlier. From there, as the helicopter was flying overhead, their shadow appeared to be circling them, until it supposedly appeared in front of them, and when the spotlight was gone, so was the supposed monster. But there is, of course, always the possibility that they were just lying. The creature was starting to get some sort of popularity, and perhaps they were hoping on sharing in the fame of witnessing the monster. It's not like there were any other witnesses beyond them, and the only real evidence they had was a burn mark, which could easily be made by anything else. Another possibility is that the couple witnessed something genuine and had originally believed it to be something unnatural, only to later realized it was something natural, and once they told their story, the individuals who had listened to it neglected the rational explanation to the sighting and simply perpetuated the unnatural version of it. Now, there are a few things that I haven't been able to explain that perhaps could give credence to the idea that what these people witnessed was at least slightly genuine. This is specifically in regards to the violet light and the burn mark. Try as I might, I cannot think or find a single thing that could realistically have been residing in the woods in the early 1950s that could emit anything remotely violet in hue. The only two things that I could even consider is that maybe it was some sort of movie shoot happening in the middle of the woods for some reason, or a police car, since it emits both red and blue colored lights, which maybe from a long enough distance may appear as if the lights are mixing and therefore perhaps also the colors theoretically forming a soft violet hue. But all of this is just pure conjecture. In regards to the burn mark, it's something that is, again, difficult to explain. I mean, not much can make a burn mark in the middle of the woods, especially in a V shape. My best explanation is that the mark was made by some sort of machinery while the engine was originally being replaced, and it wasn't noticed until the attendant pointed it out, although it is quite implausible to suggest that they wouldn't have noticed such a large burn mark in the shape of a V, especially since it was pointed out by someone after the event.
However, overall, it is quite difficult to explain this encounter as a whole, if we hold it to be genuine and not an over-exaggeration of witnessed events or just an outright lie, and especially these two aspects of the encounter. Overall, it's quite difficult to explain this encounter as a whole. That is, of course, if we hold it to be genuine and not some sort of over-exaggeration of witnessed events or just an outright lie, especially in regards to those two aspects of the encounter. Now, in regard to the possibility of the first encounter with the monster, it's a lot less likely, but the symptoms felt by the witnesses do mirror some of the symptoms of mustard gas, as stated by the doctor from earlier, such as irritation of the lungs, shortness of breath, and it is a carcinogen, leading to the possibility of developing lung cancer. Now, supposedly the May family and some of the other witnesses had developed lung cancer in their later years, although I have found no evidence of such. But they did indeed suffer from this, then some of their symptoms do better mirror short-term exposure to high concentrations of mustard gas. But there is the issue that if this was mustard gas, then more than likely you would see other symptoms other than the ones I stated before, such as severe rashes and blisters, with the possibility, although highly unlikely, is still there. Another report that had occurred on that night stated the ground had shook when the thing had supposedly crashed onto the earth, and that her radio had given out. Her mother had reported that her and her daughter had supposedly encountered the monster before the infamous night, and that her daughter had been hospitalized for 3 weeks after their encounter. In addition, the Board of Education had also reported a spacecraft to have taken off at around 6:30 in the morning, so it wasn't just one person or an isolated group of people that had reported something strange going on in that day, but it was several. Was it just mass lies and hysteria? Well, probably, but what if it wasn't? One thing that some people might claim is that the Flatwoods monster was based off of Mothman, since they do share similar characteristics, such as a dark figure, circular glowing red eyes, a rounded face, and both have mechanisms that allow them to move through the air, and they both have been described to be about as tall as the other. Not to mention they both are located in West Virginia. However, the Flatwoods monster was initially reported a full 14 years before the first Mothman encounter. The possibility that the encounter was made up after the Mothman encounters and simply said to predate Mothman is also just completely disproved with newspaper articles published at the time. So definitively, the Flatwoods monster was definitely not based off of Mothman. So assuming that both sightings were genuine and they both had seen something without a natural or rational explanation, let's look further as to what it is that these people could have encountered. While the two major sightings have said that this creature was supposedly alien-like, perhaps it was actually another unknown terrestrial organism that is more well-known and was just misidentified as alien-like. A more mundane theory that has been proposed as to what organism could have been seen that fateful night, at least the first encounter, is a giant salamander. Now, as I mentioned before, West Virginia is home to hellbenders, species of giant salamanders that can grow up to 2 feet in length. Japan has the largest species of these giant salamanders, some growing up to 5 feet. A theory formed by Trey Swenton, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, another skeptic of the tale of Flatwoods monster, had proposed the theory that perhaps what the witnesses saw was a giant species of hellbender that had a red coloration on its base. When they shined the flashlight onto the organism, the slimy skin of the salamander shined in a manner that is reminiscent of metal, and they presumed it to be a robotic suit. However, he only really proposed the theory entirely assuming this was a unique organism and not a barn owl encounter, which he highly favored. A less mundane theory is that perhaps they had encountered a Sasquatch. Plenty of Bigfoots have been described as 7 to 10 feet tall, although not as common. The supposed hood could have simply been furred, some sort of long hair that this type of Bigfoot can grow out. Or it could have been leaves behind the Bigfoot that seemed to look like a hood. In regards to the smell, there is said to be a species of Bigfoot that lives in Florida named the skunk ape, notorious for its noxious odor. Similar to the owl, the shining red eyes could have been due to eye shine, although this would make Bigfoot the first primate to have eye shine, so if the Bigfoot theory holds any sort of water, this is not likely. Perhaps the eyes were bloodshot or simply red. Perhaps the species of Bigfoot also had a reddish face, which would account for the supposed mask. And if its fur was wet for whatever reason, the shine from the flashlight could perhaps make it seem metallic. But of course, none of the witnesses reported seeing the monstrosity with any fur. Also keep in mind, the witnesses said the mask was featureless. But it wasn't seen for long anyways. And keep in mind, this was all in the dark. If you are one to believe in Bigfoot, perhaps this theory might be satisfactory for you. As mentioned before, the Flatwoods monster and Mothman do share similarities, and both of these creatures were seen in West Virginia, so perhaps there is a linkage of some kind, though there were no reported significant disasters that happened in Flatwoods after the encounter. Quite to the contrary, Flatwoods rose in popularity, commerce, and tourism, all in account to their green monster. So in this aspect, among others, such as the notable stench, there are distinct differences between the two creatures. But perhaps this isn't any creature native to Earth. Maybe it isn't even a creature at all, or anything biological. Maybe it's something that comes from a place all too familiar. You know, the military was awfully quick responding to this supposed alien encounter. And it's not like they were trying to silence witnesses or anything. They went immediately to take environmental samples, and they never released the results to the public. It is evident they are hiding something, but what, no one really knows. So I've devised a few theories as to how the military could be linked with this supposed close encounter. 1. This was a psychological weapon made by the military themselves and tested against American civilians to test the effectiveness of the weapon. They collected environmental samples in order to determine if the weapon would leave behind any sort of trace after it left. They especially chose an unknown town since it was more likely to be dismissed as a simple folktale that no one outside the town would even hear about. And they especially chose America since it was the only location they could choose to experiment on a live population where they would not incite possible war, and they had complete jurisdiction to collect any environmental samples that they would be looking for. However, once the encounter had been publicized to the extent that it had, even though it was reported as an alien encounter, the effects of the weapon were described in too much detail that they just had to scrap the project altogether. 2. The military had developed the weapon to be used in case the Cold War heated up as a psychological weapon against the Soviet soldiers. However, it was accidentally launched to Flatwoods, West Virginia, where it then activated when the group had encountered it. 3. This was a weapon created by the Soviets and used against American civilians. The military discovered this and investigated the site for evidence that the weapon was there. This evidence was not released to the public in case of a nationwide panic. 4. The military was an alien watch due to the rise of supposed alien encounters spreading across the US. This was one of, if not the only encounter that had gained any sort of popularity in which aliens were acting aggressive against the human population. The military searched for evidence of this threat and found none. Or 5. The military was aware that an alien had indeed attacked the location and were looking to cover it up, but got too involved to not arouse suspicion, so they decided to let the media continue with their story and nationwide skepticism play out. Of course, this is all speculation. There's no evidence whatsoever to support any of these theories. It's just conjecture. But personally, for me, if I'm going to choose any of the 4, I would have to say that it would be 4, that the government was just on alien watch. And now, to address the most popular of all the theories. By far, the most popular and perpetuated theory of what was seen that night was an alien. So, let's look into the possibilities and what may support. First, the craft had reported to be on the hill and glow, with the indentation of the grass supporting the idea that there was something there. The glow is rather unnatural and there isn't much, say, outside of a massive foxfires, which were not found at the scene, that could replicate such an occurrence. The creature itself was also said to glow internally, which, once again, is not something that occurs naturally. To clarify, I don't mean that there isn't any organism that can glow internally. Bioluminescence is a thing. What I mean is that there is no known 10-foot tall terrestrial or aerial organism that is bioluminescent. Also, it is likely that people in Flatwoods would know what a barn owl looks like, and Eugene specifically pointed his flashlight expecting to see a perched owl, only to see the thing instead. In addition, they specifically said that the creature floated towards them, and none of them described any flapping. In addition, the metallic barrel in the lower half of the body was consistent between both known sightings of the monster. In regards to the couple, both of them had described a soft violet light, of which nothing natural is known that can luminesce in violet in the middle of the woods in West Virginia in the 1950s, and nothing rationally artificial could do the same thing in the 1950s that would be in the middle of the woods, or would be used in the middle of the woods in the dead of the night. The couple had also stated that the monster had been incredibly close to their car, and from there, they described it in detail, giving a similar description to what is typically depicted from reptilians and not a disembodied light. The conspiracy of alien reptilians wasn't really popularized until 1999, a full 47 years before the supposed reptilian encounter. To add, there aren't that many things that can actually leave a notable burn mark in the shape of a V on the car in the middle of the woods in the dead of the night. And in regards to the smell, do you know what has a similar smell to burnt metal and sulfur? Rocket fuel. Something that is likely to be used by some spacefaring organism to reach a foreign planet. Also, not much explains the oily substance that was found in their clothing, since, once again, there isn't really anything that we know of that can spew black oil and move and light up and float all of the 1950s in the middle of the woods in a small town. So, was it indeed an alien? Well, probably not. But there are a few things more difficult to explain that the idea of an extraterrestrial does ease.
I personally believe what all the other skeptics believe, and that this was just a barn owl that they saw right after they saw a meteor. But assuming that for whatever reason this wasn't a barn owl and this theory was not true and one of the more outlandish theories is correct, I would personally believe that this was actually a Bigfoot. You know, there's this interesting phenomenon called Bigfoot UFOs, in where Bigfoots are seen after a UFO is seen. Now, what causes it, that's beyond me. But perhaps this was one such case. Really, my main issue is the one with the couple. Now, while I did devise the helicopter theory in order to explain what they saw, there are quite a few things that I'm not really satisfied with, like the violet light. Now, of course, this is even if they were telling the truth, but I always try to see it as if they were being genuine. And if this was the case, I have no real reasonable explanation for that. I personally am not a believer in the Flatwood monster, and I do believe in everything else that I explained. But either way, I feel like I've told you enough of what I believe. I'm curious. What do you believe?